would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. In Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Hey, Housers, it's Michael Braithwaite here, your host from Blue Door, and you are listening to On the Way Home. Thank you for tuning in. This podcast is brought to you by the good people at Blue Door with our partners at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. Listen, the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness has their conference up and ready to go. You should register. It's happening in the fall. Register now for early bird pricing. You don't want to miss it. The best and the brightest from around the world all come together. Great things happen at that conference. So check it out at caeh.ca as well. All the wonderful things they're doing around training and other pieces at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And as well, go to bluedoor.ca and check out the great work my team is doing there. Our construction social enterprise construct, our new land trust model, all the different programs we're running there to help our most vulnerable across York Region. Check those out. I am so excited for you to join today's episode. Quite often when you go to a funder and say, we're looking for some funding, their first question is, show me the data. So I love having researchers on the show. And today we have Mallory VanMeeter and Jacqueline White, two researchers from the US who are doing work around family and natural supports. And really what they're looking at is, we talk a lot about today, housing not being enough, is that connectiveness to people. And often for youth, we have the host homes model where you put a young person in a stranger's home and they have the best of intentions and it's awesome and they stay there rather than staying in a shelter. But how many youth, would be better served if it was someone they knew, someone they identify as family, or someone they care about, someone that cares about them? And is that possible? So they did this awesome research report called Strengthening the Village. And it really talks about what are the barriers stopping this from happening. And sometimes it might be that a young person would stay with their grandmother, but maybe that grandmother in that building isn't allowed to have visitors stay longer than a certain amount of time. Maybe there's a financial burden of having someone else in the house. So different barriers to that happening. And how can we take away these barriers? How can we look at, maybe it's a win-win for the grandmother and that individual? Can they work with a landlord to take a look at the rules and see if they can be changed so this can work, because that person has a connection there, and it can be an important, very important tool in preventing homelessness. And so we have this great conversation all around that and the work they're doing, how they got there, what the results are, what the hopes are for the future. Take a listen. If you're really curious about homelessness prevention, and some great data that can actually work in every area of youth homelessness, where you can lend this kind of thought process to it, you won't regret it. It was an awesome conversation. I really enjoyed it. I think you will too. Jacqueline and Mallory, so happy to have you here to discuss this very important and awesome work that you've done and you continue to do. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Michael.
We ask the same question for everyone because I think it's a personal question to people because it means something a little different. There's similar themes along the way. And that question is, what is home, or what does home mean to you? And I've asked the question about 200 times. You think I'd get it right? And so we're going to start with Jacqueline and then go to Mallory.
Okay. Home for me, it's where my people are. It's a sense of really profound belonging. I guess I subscribe to the Robert Frost poem that says, home is a place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. So, yeah, it's your people. You belong there.
That is awesome. We never had Robert Frost quoted ever on this podcast. That's the first, and that is terrific. Mallory, how about yourself?
Sure. I think for me, when I think of home, I think of the memories and the things that we do together with people we care about to bring space alive. So things like cooking food, eating meals together, making art, having difficult conversations. So all of those things, the sort of the stuff of living and shared living is what I think of when I think of home.
Beautifully said. Both amazing. That's great, and both very unique too. So thank you for that. Here's something that's never mentioned when I ask that question. No one ever talks about the four walls and a roof, because home is much more than that. We always like to learn a little bit about our guests before we get rolling and talk about the awesome stuff you're doing. So we want to learn a little bit about your journey. So Mallory, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Jacqueline.
Sure. Yeah. So I first started doing work related to youth homelessness when I was an undergrad in Chicago. I spent some time in community with folks at the Broadway Youth Center, which is on the north side. And they taught me a lot about the problem of youth homelessness and also the resilience of the young people who face that challenge. And I went on to work at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago, looking at stories of youth from across the country in the US through the Voices of Youth Count initiative. And that was also an eye-opener because I started to connect the dots between the challenges that youth face and the challenges that their families and communities face, and see the larger picture of what was at the root of youth housing instability. And then I am now in a PhD program at the University of Wisconsin, where I'm continuing to dive into these issues with a particular focus on the role that family writ large and community have in the lives of young people who are experiencing housing instability. So that's what brings me to this work.
Yeah, and for me, my commitment to youth homelessness and radically reimagining how we address youth homelessness is rooted in my personal experience. This was a couple decades ago. I was a host in a program that I have subsequently learned to identify as a stranger match program, in which community volunteers offer to provide a place to stay and a caring presence for young people who they've never met before. And so when I first thought about wanting to scale up and do more to help youth facing homelessness, I thought about that experience and thought, we just need to scale that up and get more people to come forward and be hosts, and this could really make a difference. I found out pretty quickly that it's really hard to find people who will say, "Oh, sure, I have an extra bedroom. You're a traumatized young person. Here's the key to my house. Come on in." Yeah, it's not a common. It's hard to find people who are willing to do that, and yet there are all kinds of people who are informally hosting young people who they already know. It's their daughter's best friend. It's the neighbor kid. It's their cousin's kid. That's happening all the time. And so that was the pivot, pretty big pivot to make, to really look at a solution that can be really scalable in addressing youth homelessness. So we'll talk more about that.
Amazing. Thank you both for sharing. And you're so right. When I worked with a group called 360 Kids in York region and just north of Toronto. And we did a host homes program that was transported over from the UK called Night Stop. right? And so I'm familiar with what you're saying. Is finding hosts very difficult, and what you're saying makes total sense. And we are going to discuss that in full. So we want to talk a little bit about in our sector. Quite often, you hear the term family and natural supports, FNS. But for those individuals who may not be familiar with that, can you talk a little bit about what is it and why does it matter to youth experiencing homelessness? And I think we'll go to Mallory for this one.
Yeah. This project that we're going to be talking about is under the banner Strengthening the Village. And that comes from that sort of phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, right? And so when we say that, family and natural supports are that village, right? It's the people who show up for you, even when things are really hard. And when we say family and natural supports, like I sort of referenced earlier, we're also thinking about not just the family that you were born into, but also the family that you choose and the people that you choose to call family. And that's particularly important when we're talking about youth facing homelessness, many of whom identify as LGBTQ two-spirit plus. And so family and natural supports is sort of, I would say Canada has been a huge leader in this space of thinking about applying this family and natural supports lens, recognizing the importance of family and natural supports, particularly for young people who are unstably housed. It's sort of a pillar of the prevention work that's going on across Canada. So, we drew a lot of inspiration from that in our efforts to bring that lens to the US context. I think part of that is because, a lot of the research and the stories that we tell about youth homelessness start from that place of family conflict, disconnection, and that's real. That is a really important and big part of the story of how young people become unstably housed. But at the same time, how do we hold on to the fact that young people also have people in their lives who care about them? And they not only have those people who support them, but they matter to the young person. The youth prioritize those relationships. And they make a difference. I mean, we have a ton of research to suggest that, having those connections, those family and natural supports actually result in better outcomes in terms of well-being, housing stability, and all sorts of things. So it's just critical that we shine a light on this approach and sort of not just think of it as a one approach among many to addressing youth homelessness, but sort of part of every intervention that we use, right? So whether you're doing shelter-based intervention, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, host homes, you name it. I think that, figuring out how are you working towards family and natural supports in that space is really critical. Jacqueline, I don't know if you wanted to speak to the piece around permanent connection and, how that happens here in the US as well as part of the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, bringing an international perspective to the podcast here, since we're based in the US, that the language family and natural supports isn't as big in the US. What we have are the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness has identified 4 core outcomes for ending youth homelessness: stable housing, something they call permanent connections, education, employment, so you either need to be in school or have a job, and social emotional well-being. So there is a framework for a holistic response in the U.S. And I think that I love, and that doesn't always get as full of a traction as might be ideal. So I think think a lot of times the focus gets on the stable housing and the education and employment. And actually, when we talk with young people, and some research from Chapin Hall has shown that as well, what they say of the 4 federal outcomes, they say what is most important to them: permanent connections, social emotional well-being. They want to feel connected, and they want to feel good, right? And so the question really then becomes, how do we create a system that really centers that need? If we are saying we want to listen to the young people, and this is what they're saying, we need to really look at how to build a system that centers that need that they have. So it's really a pushback on the Maslow's pyramid, which gets cited a lot, that we need to address what people might call basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, before we address what are considered higher level needs. And yet, I mean, I think of a young person I spoke with once who said, when I was couch hopping, I would have rather have had someone care about me than have a place to stay. So, human beings are profoundly social animals. We need, we crave, we need, we thrive in connection.
Yeah.
It makes total sense. All right. So take a shelter situation, right? And I always learn, I try and learn through the many failures that I've had or been part of, where you take a shelter situation. We have a men's shelter. So you take 30 dudes, we put them all together for 4 months, and then they've got people that care about them, staff that are there. You don't come back at night, someone wants to know, where have you been? Are you okay? Everything's fine. You got buddies there, you got this little community, right? You said that you're connected. And same thing with youth, right? When you have youth shelters, I connect. I know, I might have known people through foster care, whatever. This is my community. Then we say our kind of thing is, all right, we're going to put you in housing. We put you in this house on your own. No one cares whether you come and go, right? No one's checking in on you. No one can, there's no. And then so 2 months later, they're back in the shelter. You're like, what happened, man? We worked so hard to find that affordable housing for you. But that connectiveness that you're talking about is huge. The work is not over when you throw 4 walls and a roof over someone. There has to be that sense of connectivity. So I love what you're saying. And we know that in Canada, anyways, when some of the best research that the Observatory in Away Home Canada did was in 2017. They did a big survey with youth nationally, and 80% of youth that I think left that experienced homelessness for the first time said it was due to family breakdown, right? So that connected to, but why do so many people return and stay? And then I think also child welfare, right? When kids are taken into care, most child welfare agencies really try hard to connect them back to family. Like, how can you do that? Well, but that's what they know. And a lot of kids, if you ask them, even when it's really bad at home, and maybe they shouldn't, but they'll say, that's where I want to go because I'm connected. Those are my people, right? Or some family member, someone that has a link to the family or that you're right. We build these little communities, and then sometimes through the best of intentions, we tear them apart, and it really throws the system off. So let's talk a little bit about your most recent collaboration, and it's called Strengthening the Village. How did it come about? What's its focus? Jacqueline, this time we'll start with you.
Yeah. And I just want to, just in terms of the conversation you were just having there, really make a distinction when we're talking about natural supports. We're talking about unpaid connections, right? The people, because I think a lot of paid providers, there's an expiration date on that relationship, right? They're not going to be where you go for the holidays for the next 20 years. That's not where you're going to go. And yet, even if there is family breakdown, that doesn't mean that there aren't, in the immediate family, it doesn't mean that there aren't other people in the young person's circle who are caring for them, and care about them. Yeah, so The new project, the genesis of that is really Mallory and I have collaborated on some other work previously, and with some other really terrific researchers, and the basis of that was really this question about taking a closer look at couch hopping, right? I think that there's an assumption in the youth homeless field often that if a young person is couch hopping, that's a dangerous situation. They're unstably housed, they're at risk for exploitation. We don't want them there. And it's absolutely true that sometimes that is the case. And we wanted to really say, is that really always the case though? I know if there'd been something wrong at my house and I needed to find a place to stay, I would have gone to my best friend Vicky's house, and I would have been fine at Vicky's house. So, let's really look at where are these young people staying and what are those relationships like. So we did a series of interviews with youth and with what we would call informal hosts, and the criteria was that they had to be at least a 10-year difference between the youth and the host. They had to have been there for at least 3 weeks, and there couldn't be a sexual or romantic relationship. So trying to look at, where there might be some possibilities for stability. And so the first paper, this is a peer-reviewed, and it is on the Close-Knit website. I'm the founder and former executive director of Close-Knit, so closeknit.us is one place you can find it. The first paper was called Beyond a Bed, and it was about what we found is that these relationships were about much more than just food and shelter. They were overwhelmingly what both youth and hosts said these were meaningful relationships, and even talked about them in terms of family. And even sometimes for the youth, the family I never really had. So these are, profoundly meaningful relationships. The second paper, again, peer-reviewed, that we published is called The Cost of Caring, which also kind of tips you to what we're talking about, that, having another person in your house, it's expensive, right? There's costs, financial costs associated with that. And what we found in particular was that if you are a homeowner, you are in a much better place to provide stability and extend generosity than if you are a renter. And that has real race equity issues. In the U.S., I can again speak from the U.S. context, redlining historically has prevented home ownership for a lot of Black, Indigenous people of color. And so there's just a glaring racial inequity in home ownership rates. So looking at the challenges that renters face is, like I said, a really deep race equity issue. I'd like to just share one interview that I was fortunate to be able to do. We'll call the person Geraldine. I'm doing the air quotes here. So Geraldine was African-American, disabled wife, mother. She had helped raise her nephew and then lost track of him, tracked him down on Facebook, found out he was living in a gang area. She was like, I don't want you to be there. She did what any caring auntie would do. She said, you come stay with me, right? The problem was that she lived in subsidized housing. There was a restriction on her lease that said you can only have a guest for 2 weeks. So Geraldine said it was a really good thing that her nephew worked the late shift at McDonald's, because that meant he could sneak in after hours so the neighbors wouldn't know that he was actually staying there. And I just want to say again, this is a young African-American man. So, he's basically sneaking around like a criminal, not having done anything wrong, just wanting, to stay with his auntie who cares about him and loves him and is offering him, to be able to sleep on his couch. So, I was not surprised, unfortunately, for her when she said, he's kind of depressed, right? He can't get mail. He doesn't have an address. It's hard to imagine a future, right? And so this Strengthening the Village project really starts at that point where we look at people like Geraldine, who is offering profound hospitality, who is willing to risk her own housing. I mean, how much more of a connection do we want? How much more love can you offer than to say, I'm going to risk my own housing because I care this much about you. So how do we really stabilize those relationships and make that a ongoing safe place for a young person?
Can I also add to that, Jacqueline? I think an important piece of this puzzle is that, prior to this work, we knew that couch hopping and doubling up were a huge part of youth experiences of housing instability. The sort of national survey, household survey in the US that was done found that I think half of the young people who reported homelessness over the course of a year had at some point been doubled up or couch hopping without another stable place to stay. And there's been a huge push as well in the US to include in federal definitions of homelessness youth who are doubled up couch hopping so that they have access to the services that they need. And so, as a result, I think a lot of the focus has been on those risks, like Jacqueline said, on risks, instability, without asking the question, what's causing this instability? Like, what's at the root of it, right? And if we start to ask that question, if we know youth have people, these people provide help, these relationships are important. Sometimes youth stay with these caring adults, but right, there's these financial challenges. Youth are more likely to come from low-income households and backgrounds, more likely to be BIPOC, so their people, their village, these are stressed communities. They've been disinvested. They don't have a ton of resources to share. And despite that, they're sharing their housing. And so I think it's, then you have to reflect on what is the role of the system then, and in policymakers, service providers. If we start to grapple with this instability as sort of a place where we could do better, to do right by these people and help them care for these young people that they so obviously care about. So I think that's just another piece of this story as well.
Yeah, how do we remove those barriers for sure? Quick little interesting thing. You call it couch hopping, Canada. We call it couch surfing. The UK, they call it sofa surfing.
Surfing, yeah.
Sofa, it sounds much nicer when they say it, and it's not. It's the same thing. Let's talk about, there are three main parts of the report. And I think, Mallory, you're going to start us off and talk about one of them, and then Jacqueline will talk about the other pieces.
Yeah, so we have one large report, and it was originally just going to be this one report. And then we were like, oh no, we have so much more to talk about. We need to do some other pieces to go along with it. But the sort of genesis of this was for me to look at the research evidence that we have on the role of natural supports, family and natural supports in the lives of young people and youth facing homelessness, and to use this evidence, sort of organize it, put it all in one place, and sort of make the case that I think we've been making on the call, that these supports, these relationships are important, and we can do more to promote stability when youth stay with people they trust in safe and supportive informal shared housing situations. And so the report basically tells the story of the role of interdependence in young adulthood. So starting from that place, I think in the Western context, we often talk a lot about independence, bootstrapping, right? Like youth, that successful transitions to adulthood mean becoming independent, self-sufficient. But in reality, in the US, over half of young adults ages 18 to 25 are living with their parents, right? And that's just part of how our economic system currently operates. And so regardless how you feel about that, we have to not hold youth to the double standard, saying that like, okay, everyone else is sort of relying on their networks. Interdependence is really important for young adults who are stably housed. But for youth who are facing homelessness, we're telling them, okay, you do this program, and then you're expected to kind of make it on your own, right? And so when we shift to saying, okay, let's recognize, celebrate, and resource youth's community, the village, then we can have a different conversation about couch hopping, sofa surfing, whatever you want to call it, and identify situations that could be longer term if necessary, that are safe and supportive, right? And once we can identify those, we can then say what supports do the host and the youth need to make that happen. And so that's sort of the next step. But the larger report sets up that argument. And then the other two briefs kind of look at specific practice and policy implications of this larger framework.
Yeah. So one of the policy brief, we've been talking about sort of definitions here a little bit, touching on different ways. So what do we really talk about when we are wanting to talk about, in the U.S. context, permanent connections? And so there's been some sort of fuzziness about that, and I think really wanting to push folks to think about the natural support people, the people who will be in the youth's life long term, as opposed to paid providers who are providing wonderful support for the young people, but are not in a position most often to be there for years to come, right? And so we want so this policy brief really makes the case that we need to be looking at intergenerational relationships. I think another thing that happens often is there's an idea that the youth will help one another, and they do, of course. And yet, again, when we look at what is normative, young adults have older parental figures who they are relying on. And so having some kind of, recognizing the need for intergenerational support for youth facing homelessness is also important. So we are really, Mallory is really looking at clarifying so that folks know in the youth homeless sector, when we are wanting to help young people build community, how we want to define that community so that they have that long-term support. And then the practice brief is really looking more specifically at the host home model and looking at a comparison between what I think is the most common when we say host home. The most common thing that people think about is the stranger match model, which also it fits in our sort of the dominant paradigm that we operate in the social service sector, which looks let me start over again. There's the white savior kind of model. It kind of is part of what often happens in a traditional host home stranger match model. So the people who end up getting recruited are often people like me, white, I'm college educated, middle class person, and we know that youth facing homelessness, again in the U.S. context, overrepresentation of BIPOC youth, overrepresentation of youth who are poor, right? And so you often end up with a mismatch, which was true for me and my partner when we were hosting. We were white. The young woman we were hosting was Puerto Rican, actually. So, and yet we're kind of used to operating this way. I think the social service sector, we're good-hearted people. We want to help, and so making to really look at making a shift to resourcing chosen family is a really deep shift. That it isn't just sort of like, oh, okay, we'll just start resourcing the people already in the kid's life rather than, finding people. It's a really profound shift. And to really do it, it is a transformation because of the barriers that many of the people who the young people go to for help they're underestimated, they're under-resourced, and so that requires system change and policy change in order to really provide stability there. It's a very different way of thinking. I cannot say that enough.
Yeah, and I think I did my master's thesis research on host home programs in the U.S. And one of the things that came up when I talked to folks who were doing stranger match hosting was that cultural mismatch, the feeling that the youth had of being in an Airbnb or a hostel kind of environment versus a home, right? And that's not the fault of the hosts. They're working within a system that sort of is outside of them. But I think, if we start to think about host home programs as an opportunity for community capacity building, right? Not just let's address the housing needs of this youth, right? We're actually building stronger social safety nets, informal social safety nets in communities, and directing resources from the public systems to those communities directly. That to me feels like a really potentially transformational shift in practice. But like Jacqueline said, that doesn't, all of the barriers that we've been talking about, like rental housing restrictions, public housing voucher rules and regulations. Then you get into questions about, if you're helping the host with utility payments or other sorts of financial support who are taking in this young person, then suddenly that has implications for their taxes, for their benefits eligibility. And Chapin Hall actually has a great resource that came out this past year, I think, on it was on the sort of policy implications of how to design a direct cash transfer program, which is a different context, but a lot of the same sort of issues apply if you're thinking about providing financial help to families who are informally or formally hosting young people. So there's ways to work around it, but that's sort of currently not necessarily in the purview of how host home programs operate. So it is a shift, and this is just the sort of, it's the beginning of a conversation, right? We're sort of just sending out some seeds, and hopefully, over the next few years, we can both sort of refine what it would look like to implement this type of intervention, and evaluate and see, like, are our theories about this, the impacts of this on, youth permanent connection, does that actually bear out in terms of what we see the impacts on the young people are.
Very, very cool. I love everything you're saying. It's just, I just think about how traumatic it is for a young person to experience homelessness. And then, as you said, despite the best intention of any host, not having any connection, how awkward and weird and strange, and to someone who's already going through one of the most traumatic, if not the most traumatic experience of their lifetime. So a couple different questions. I want to know, what are your hopes for this moving forward? You kind of touch on that. And is there kind of some kind of light at the end of that tunnel through funding?
Yeah, well, I can speak to that. Yeah, because we got to fund this, and ultimately, if you're looking at population level system change, which is what this requires, you need to have government funding. And I will say, in my conversations with policymakers on the state and federal level in the U.S., the question that I get is, do you have any research on that? So I'm really, really pleased to be able to say, well, actually, yes, we do. There is a research basis for this approach. And in terms of what this actually can look like in practice, we do have some, we piloted some work in this regard. So we have some ideas. And this, again, is based on what we were hearing when we actually listened to the youth and listened to the hosts. And so through philanthropic funding, able to do a pilot program at Hope for Youth in Anoka, which is a little bit north of the Twin Cities. And I guess the best way to explain that program actually is to tell a story of a young man who was in a situation similar to Geraldine's nephew. He was also a young African-American man. He was staying with his granny, and it was in an apartment. And Granny, she got to a point where, my blood pressure, I can't take this. You're not supposed to be here. There's a 2-week guest policy. I'm going to just ask you by the end of the month, can you find a different place to stay, right? So he shows up at the drop-in, and, I think, again, in the U.S. context, there's not a lot of affordable housing. There's not a lot much to offer him, right? It's not like, So Brenda, who was the case coach for this pilot program, Rockstar Case Coach, met with, call him Joe, and was able to find out that he'd rather have his own place, but he was fine staying with Granny. And so then the issue was, well, is there a way we could talk to the landlord? So Brenda talked with Granny and got her permission, and so she was able to talk with the landlord. And the program basically addressed what landlords want, right? They want their money, and they don't want any problems, right? And so the program offered a stipend, so there would be more resources coming into a monthly. It was modest. It was $200 US, modest stipend. So there was more stability, financial stability in the household, and that could be paid directly to the landlord if that was what the youth and the host agreed on. They got to decide how to spend that money, and then landlords, they don't want any problems, right? And this was even more important, Brenda found, to landlords than the money, was saying, here is my business card. If there is a problem here in this relationship, you are not going to be alone with this. You call me, right? Again, it's this relationship building, and it's seeing, the landlord as a human being who is trying to provide a service and sometimes needs help, right? So in that case, Brenda was able to convince the landlord and so Joe was able to continue to stay. And it was a much less. It really ratcheted down the tension in the relationship to be able to go and live above board, and that is a big transition that we also see is a lot of the youth really are living under the radar. And so what does it take to bring them above board? And that's one example. So currently, there's a bill in the Minnesota legislature for a $2 million pilot that would look at providing resource hubs to provide this kind of support to chosen family hosting arrangements statewide. So fingers crossed that will come through. So we're super excited.
Yeah, we're all crossing our fingers. But yeah, I think, one of the things that's exciting to me is that I can see a lot of open doors in current program models, not just host homes, to start thinking about informal shared housing in a different way. So for example, I have some colleagues who are doing work around direct cash transfer plus services around rapid rehousing. And historically, those program models have been very centered on the housing piece, which is perhaps unsurprising, but I think that there's some really clear alignment there, to particularly because of the affordable housing crisis that I know is affecting both the US and Canada, to look at community networks, youth connections as potential affordable housing providers. So I think that that's something that I'm looking forward to being in dialogue with folks about, to try and get this on people's radars. I think it sort of is. So I think I've talked to some people who are running, direct cash transfer programs, and I'm like, oh, are any youth using the money to, stay with family or anything? And they're like, oh yeah, we had a couple of young people that went and stayed with their sister and helped her pay rent. And I'm like, great, okay. So is that a formal part of the program? Are you actually presenting that option to youth explicitly? And at the moment, that's often not happening. It's just that youth are choosing to do that on their own, or, in some cases. So I think that that's a sort of exciting opportunity that I see in the field. I would also add that I think I sort of referenced it. I'm for my dissertation research, I'm going to be looking back at the Voices of Youth Count interviews, which were with 212 young people in 5 different communities in the US. And I'm basically looking at their stories. They sort of paint the picture of their experience of housing instability, and looking at those periods of time where they were staying with someone informally. And I think this is coming from a place of trying to build a deeper evidence base to back up this approach and this framing, because I think there's a lot of fear about investing in informal shared housing. And I think it's fair because, we do have evidence suggest that some of these situations aren't safe for youth. But what I'm finding is that there is a really big spectrum. And there's definitely that section on the one end that it's not safe, not supportive. All sorts of things can go wrong, certainly. But there's also a lot of other stuff in a gray area and all the way up to super stable, long-term, positive situations that for one reason or another don't work out. And so by painting this broader picture, I'm hoping to give a little bit more context to the field so that we can design better interventions and policies to work towards stability in these otherwise positive, safe situations. In some cases, that potentially means formalizing the shared housing, right? Setting up a leasing agreement, getting them on the lease, or working with a host home program. There's certainly benefits to that as well that can be important, but yeah, trying to build an evidence base. And also the one other thing to add that's sort of I think an important part of the story that is coming out of that work is that overwhelmingly informal shared housing is kind of the first step in their journey for young people. It's often the first place they land when they can't stay at home or when they leave their place, like residential placement, foster home, wherever they're staying long term. Often the first place they go is someone they know. And so although not all of those are good situations, just like I said earlier, there's a wide range of experiences that youth have in that first place that they land. I think if we look at it as a whole, this is a huge opportunity to work towards primary prevention and early prevention of youth homelessness, right? If we focus on these situations, identifying ones which are safe and supporting them, I think that will pay huge dividends in terms of preventing deeper end involvement, shelter stays, and other forms of harm that youth experience when they have repeated and long-term experiences of housing instability.
I don't know, it's huge in the prevention world. And let's, we be realistic for a moment too, right? We need more housing options. And this is a housing option that provides connections that can work, as you said, that first step in the process. As someone who has 3 adult children at home, because of the realities, financial realities in life, everyone should have that option to have that connection. And I love what you're saying, that this could be a part of all sorts of those cash transfer or any type of housing project that you're doing that we don't currently look at, and we should get out of our own way. This is incredible work. If people want to check out this work or all the other incredible and impactful work you've been doing, where do they go?
Well, yeah. Well, proud to say that Homeless Hub has the Strengthening the Village report. We're always wanting to plug Canada. It's on the Chapin Hall website, so please go there. And there's and closeknit.us also has a deeper dive into, well, it has the preliminary research that we were talking about, and a deeper dive into some of the policy issues, for example, under the radar versus coming above board. What does that look like? There's some other materials like that. And I would be happy to continue this conversation with anyone. So you can reach me at jw@jacquelinewhite.net. That's the French spelling of Jacqueline. Yeah. So.
Yep. Yeah, definitely encourage folks to take a look at the report and the briefs. We have some resources linked through there in those reports as well. And CloseKnit's website also has some really useful resources for programs that are interested in exploring natural supports approaches to host homes, circle map exercise to help youth identify their connections. So lots to learn there. You can find me on the Chapin Hall website. That's my bio has all of the work that I'm involved in. Yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn if you're interested in being in dialogue. I would love to hear from folks.
Yeah, LinkedIn for me too.
Amazing. Thank you both. This has been just incredible learning experience for us on the podcast. That's why we do this, to share this information, and it's very scalable. I encourage people to go check out this work. reach out to Jacqueline or Mallory if you have any questions or ideas or thoughts. Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time. And Mallory, I guess if we have you back in the future, we'll have to call you Dr. Mallory. Is that?
That's right. Eventually. Thank you.
Congrats on that. Tons of respect for you both for this work. It is so impactful. And as you said, first question you often get asked by funders is, show me the data. Why? Show me the proof. And you're doing exactly that. You're making our job easier to prevent and end youth homelessness, and it's so appreciated. Thank you for your time, and you're always welcome when you're doing other impactful work. Come back on the show. We'll see you then.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Take care.